That's right. And I'd also just would be remiss in saying that in addition to being a reunion with my colleagues here and many other folks, it also is sorts of a family reunion. Marcy Hedges, who regaled us as we were coming in, that's my cousin. So this is truly a homecoming for me, but it's really significant to bring the work that I've been doing across the country, across the globe, back to Cincinnati, because I do believe that Cincinnati at this time is ready. We have the resources, we have the will. So I want to talk about the significance of this day. Regardless of your politics, in just a few hours, the baton of national leadership will be passed here. And here, in this room, we acknowledge the need to ensure that despite the politics, the light of social justice will continue to burn bright. There are those who only see darkness ahead, but I want to remind us of the significance of this sacred space where we are gathered this morning. Right here, two settlements, Bucktown and Little Africa, where nearly 40% of enslaved people escaping bondage were welcomed to freedom in a community of freed blacks and a robust network of abolitionists. These banks also served as potent symbols of freedom from intergenerational poverty and the hopelessness of a hardscrabble life in the coal mines and hills of countless Appalachian communities in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Through slavery times, post-Reconstruction, and into the mid-20th century, this side of the banks of the Ohio represented economic opportunity and freedom for Black and white people whose ancestors were bound by a strict system of caste rooted in racial, social, and economic disparity, reinforced with systemic and physical violence. It was this history that fueled the vision behind Dr. King's final body of work, the Poor People's Campaign. A campaign that sought to bring together people of all races, disenfranchised, oppressed, and left behind socially and economically. Dr. King understood that while many of the nation's most brutal policies of social and economic exclusion were aimed at African slaves and freed Blacks, ultimately in a capitalist nation, the only color that matters is green. Slavery was an economic engine that built this country. Race was a necessary strategy to ensure its durability, but racial categories only masked the true intent to build a society based on economic class. The Kerner Commission report, ordered by President Lyndon Johnson in the aftermath of the 1968 riots following the assassination of Dr. King, found structural racism responsible for the conditions that served as fuel for social unrest that burned through our cities, including devastating Avondale's business district. The scars of that unrest are still evident in the long-standing disinvestment in the city's largest Black neighborhood. Now, these quotes that you see on the screen from that report in 1968 could be said again in 2025. The effects of frustrated hopes, a sense of powerlessness, are reflected in today's political discourse, a discourse rooted in fear. But today we gather in hope. This is a discourse of grievance divided by race and class, but masking the lack of opportunity for our growing underclass, regardless of race, but acutely defined by place. These lines of disparity are evident by examining the nation's segregation index. No city in the U.S. is 0, which is ideal, on that index. Cincinnati has a segregation index of 63%, meaning that 63% of Black residents would need to move to create an unsegregated population distribution. And why does this matter? because access to resources, financial, educational, and social, follow a gradient that is closely tied to economic vitality, which in the US reliably and intentionally follows a racial and class gradient. Growing up in Cincinnati, I did not have to go far to see the impact of intergenerational poverty in this city. Nearly 29% of all Cincinnatians live in poverty. That's nearly double the state average. Black Cincinnatians are more likely to live in poverty at 39%. But there is also a spatial pattern to Cincinnati's poverty rates that follow the fate of those who have been historically marginalized, including families who can trace their roots to Appalachia. Dr. King wrote in Where Do We Go From Here? There is nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we have the resources to get rid of it. The real question is whether we have the will. This was written in 1967. I ask you, do we have the will in 2025? Dr. King understood that economic injustice was intrinsically linked to racial and social inequality. He emphasized that poverty was not a result of individual failings, but a systemic issue requiring comprehensive solutions such as universal basic income and fair wages. This perspective continues to resonate today as millions worldwide grapple with housing insecurity, stagnant wages, and limited avenues for social mobility, even within societies of immense wealth. Cities such as ourselves. Dr. King's vision serves as a powerful reminder for policymakers, community leaders, and individuals alike to champion investments in housing, education, healthcare, and economic growth, fostering a future that upholds dignity and opportunity for everyone. Dr. King centered dignity in work, an ethic that influences my own work. Recognizing the indignity of poverty, homelessness, and lack of social and economic mobility is a moral imperative for us all. Centering dignity requires dedication to dismantling the violence of structural inequity. So let's talk about structural violence. Structural versus physical violence, and the role of systems and policies. So, physical violence, I think we all can pretty much understand that, right? Direct, visible acts of harm inflicted by individuals or groups. So, on the extreme, we could look at Dylan Roof's attack on the churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina. An obvious attack of physical violence. Structural violence is systemic harm caused by policies, institutions, and societal norms that perpetuate inequality, marginalization, or suffering, such as mass incarceration and public health inequities. Let's go further with the examples, because I want this to be very concrete for all of us today. Dylan Roof versus mass incarceration. Dylan Roof's attack represents an overt, targeted act of racialized physical violence. Mass incarceration reflects structural violence where policies such as sentencing disparities, the school-to-prison pipeline, disproportionately harm communities of color and lower-income populations, reinforcing cycles of poverty and systemic oppression. But let's take another example that maybe might not be so obvious. Sugar-sweetened beverages and opioids. The widespread availability and marketing of sugar-sweetened beverages, especially in underserved communities, highlights systemic neglect of public health. This leads to chronic health disparities, including obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and ultimately premature death. The opioid crisis showcases structural failures in addressing addiction through prevention, equitable healthcare access, and community support, exacerbating feelings of hopelessness among those affected. Now, let's talk about disparities in perception and response. Physical violence often garners immediate public outcry, thoughts and prayers, and media attention, while structural violence remains normalized, monetized, and often operating in plain sight, yet invisible or unspoken. Advocacy must center on making structural harm as urgent as physical violence in public discourse and policymaking. Now, it has been said that systems are designed for the outcomes they produce. There are no broken systems, only systems that were designed to produce brokenness and inequality. Therefore, to produce different results, we have to intentionally change systems, not just hearts and minds. Systems thinking requires cross-cutting strategies spanning public and private sectors. For example, policy solutions designed to change how systems produce outcomes more beneficial to community include advocating for equitable public health policies, such as taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, lower pricing for healthier options, and stricter regulation of marketing that targets marginalized groups. Let's help make the healthier choice the more economical choice. Push for healthcare reform that prioritizes addiction prevention, mental health access, and treatment for underserved communities. Solutions that bring together education, economic development, public health, and private investment is systems thinking applied. Now, let's talk about systems thinking applied to community-level advocacy. Supporting grassroots initiatives aimed at addressing systemic health disparities and reforming the justice system. Promoting education on the long-term impacts of structural violence, collaborating with and acting upon issues and solutions designed by community members. Let me repeat, collaborating with, acting upon those issues and solutions designed by community members. Harness the wisdom of the lived experience. Systems thinking helps us rethink priorities by encouraging leaders and policymakers to view violence reduction holistically, integrating solutions that address both physical and structural harm. Frame structural violence as a moral and ethical imperative that affects the health, safety, and dignity of entire communities. Did you hear the difference? Yes, we must address community violence holistically, but we also need to frame structural violence as a moral and ethical violence that must be addressed and recognize the effects on the health and the safety and the dignity of communities that is put at risk because of structural violence. The next generation of social justice leadership will require systems thinking from all of us. The next generation of social justice leaderships requires a bold and innovative approach to address the persistent social and economic inequities in our society. At the heart of this work lies a framework rooted in resolve, repair, and restore. Three interconnected principles that guide us toward meaningful and lasting change. Together, they challenge us to go beyond symbolic gestures and take deliberate, courageous action to create a more just future. So let's dive into this. First, resolve is the courage to confront systemic injustice head on. Leadership demands boldness, the willingness to stand firm against opposition and advocate for the marginalized. The resolve is exemplified by organizations such as Apple, Costco, Kroger, Procter & Gamble, all who have implemented initiatives to prioritize equity and inclusion in their practices. Their actions remind us that courage is not only about words, but also about bold, transformative steps that inspire others to join in the fight for justice. It's not just the spirit, it's also the green. Social justice leaders must embody this courage, paving the way for systemic transformation through their vision, determination, and investments. Now, let's talk about repair. Repair emphasizes targeted and intentional investments in communities that have been most impacted by historical and systemic harm. It's not enough to acknowledge the damage. That's the first step. But we must focus our resources where they are needed most, addressing issues such as housing disparities, access to quality education, and economic inequality. Repair means investing in places and people to build systems that provide opportunity and hope. Hope over fear. Finally, these efforts must be strategic and specific, recognizing that true justice requires a commitment to lifting up those who have been left behind. Now, restore is the ultimate goal of this leadership, to bring back dignity and create opportunities for individuals and communities to not just thrive, not just survive, but to thrive. Restoration involves breaking down systemic barriers, addressing injustices, and empowering people to reach their full potential. It is about creating a society where everyone feels valued, respected, and capable of achieving their dreams. Through this work, we can illuminate a path toward a future that is not only more just, but is also more compassionate and inclusive. The journey towards social justice requires all of us, leaders, organizations, and communities, to embrace this framework and act with urgency. With resolve, repair, and restoration as our guiding principles, we can build a movement that not only addresses the injustices of the past, but also ensures a brighter future for generations to come. Now is the time to act boldly, invest strategically, and restore hope where it has been lost. Together, we can lead the next generation of social justice and make Dr. King's legacy a living reality. MLK said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Today, in this sacred space, we can commit to breaking the cycles of social injustice that contributes to our city's seemingly intractable poverty rates. For the past 3 years, my team has worked with a community coalition including All In Cincinnati, the Avondale Community Council, Riverside Community Council, and Joining Forces for Children, and Bishop Tate here, who is with us from Avondale. We've also met with many of your elected leaders, including Mayor Purval, Vice Mayor Kearney, Council Members Johnson, Albee, Jeffries, and Owens, and many others, to understand both the barriers and the opportunities to build a more just and resilient city. This week, we have the honor of presenting the results of our wealth gap study to city and corporate and community leaders. Our plan proposes both a strategy and measures, because we know what we measure is what gets done. Not just promises, but measures to hold ourselves accountable. Measures that can help make Dr. King's dream a reality for those who have been left behind in Cincinnati. From Riverside to Avondale, from Price Hill to Evanston, now is the time for action. As we commemorate Dr. King's legacy, we also recognize the responsibility to pass the torch to the next generation. The flame that Dr. King ignited, the flame of justice, equality, and hope, burns brightly within each of us. Today, on this day, I challenge each of you to take up that torch. Be the spark that ignites change in your neighborhood, your schools, and your workplaces. Advocate for justice, stand against inequity, mentor the next generation to carry this mission forward with renewed energy and vision. The dream is not simply an idea of the past. It is a living, breathing call to action for the present and for the future. So let us carry this torch together, ensuring that the light of hope shines for every person in Cincinnati and beyond. The time is now, the responsibility is ours. So let's make history together. Together, let us build a more just and resilient Cincinnati.
How about that, Dr. Wendy Ellis? So we're going to do something, can you hear me? Okay. We're going to do something a little different. I get a chance to interview her.
Oh my,
Oh
turn the
my.
tables.
Didn't she do a great job? Wow, such great information. And I think we have enough time after I asked her a few questions that if a few of you have questions, she's willing to take a few questions from you. But I was just fascinated. I'm going to begin with the Kerner Commission report.
Yeah.
Because as I came in this morning, I walked past the statue back there, the bust of the dear friend, the late Judge Nathaniel R. Jones. Mm-hmm. And I always think about the Kerner Commission. When I first came to town, I thought, wow, I get a chance to meet Nathaniel Jones because he worked on the Kerner Commission. Mm-hmm. Says, if you haven't, it's a long, detailed report, but at some point, just pull it off the internet and read it. It speaks volumes. And so I guess, that's 1968. And you think we're still dealing with a lot of the issues that were talked about in the Kerner Commission. How is that even possible that we're dealing with this now 50-some years later?
Because racism is a hell of a drug. It is, I'm in academia, and obviously, we're supposed to research, and I had to, when I was working on my dissertation, I came into my committee and I threw down a hard copy of the Kerner Commission report, and I said, what in the world could I add to this body that the government, our report hasn't already said, that 30 years of public health research hasn't already demonstrated? That when you have policies and systems that specifically were designed to create inequality, well, surprise, surprise, we have inequality. So it is, I encourage, especially all of my students, I tell them it is worth the time to read the Kerner Commission report, because what was true in 1968 was true in 1988, was true in 2008, and certainly is true today. And where the difference may be in 2025 is, do we have the will? Because we've always had the data, but do we have the will? And it's important for academicians like myself, where you can help take the science and the data and work with policymakers, and let's intentionally design new systems and new policies, because that's the only way you're going to get different results.
And it would seem, if you look over the past, at least the past 60 years, we've had the plan, but then the implementation of the plan has been lacking. And I will say, and as I saw, is Renee Mahaffey-Harris with Closing the Healthcare Gap over there, when you talked about health disparities. Well, Dr. King talked about health disparities in the mid-'60s. He said, of all the injustices, health disparities is probably the worst. And then when you listen, you know, it's nice to hear the speech of 1963, but listen closer to the speech that he gave the night before he died. Because he gave us this roadmap of what we need to do and the things we should do. And you know what? Some of them were pretty tough. How do we get folks, you know, because he went from how we should take care of each other, how we should mentor each other, where we should spend our money. What causes people not to follow through? Because you're giving them a roadmap now. You're giving them the data. How do you get people to follow through?
Yeah, so how many people here made New Year's resolutions less than 30 days ago? And how many of those have you already broken? Your plans are only as good as how well you execute. It's not the intention, because all these plans were built with good intentions. But did you actually create an environment of which promotes that change? And we know that change is hard. A lot of folks do dry January. I tried it. I broke it within 3 days. Because January has been quite a year. But, you know, the point being is that we've spent a lot of money on strategic plans, and without actually having the tools and the resources to do it, and that was why we created the Opportunity Dashboard, is to really help people see there's not a silver bullet. But with a number of the different initiatives, whether that's in education and housing and community development, together we can move towards the change piece. But also, you know, doing some difficult work with people who don't want you in the room. And I will applaud Vice Mayor Kearney, I think she's in the room, for joining in some of those very difficult conversations that we had in Riverside. Riverside, it's not, you don't see many people like me over there. And, but it was important to have that conversation to really understand that what you see as far as disparity, whether that's in the city's investments, the quality of your roads, the zoning, or what have you, it's all the same policies. And they don't necessarily produce for you just as they don't produce for Avondale. When we're under this umbrella of this system that was meant to drive inequality, as I said, the only color that ever mattered was green. There is a caste system. And so I think the most difficult piece of that is communicating that in a way and staying in that conversation. And it wasn't just Riverside. We've done this with communities across the country. In fact, I had to have a friend of mine escort me in Bastrop, Texas, when they asked me to come down there and talk about race equity. And I said, are you kidding me? Is this a setup? But, you know, you do it because education is the key. And helping people to see that, you know, these policies are not in your best interest. That if you want change, you are going to have to advocate for a specific lever, a specific investment. And guess what? We can't have nice things because of racism. We can't have nice things because they're so afraid of giving it to someone else. And so they're willing to give up health care. They're willing to give up benefits. And I think that, you know, this is going to be a really tough next 6 months if many of the things that have been promised to be scaled back actually are enacted. And you're going to be witnessing that right here. Whether your state legislature follows suit, or whatever happens in Kentucky and West Virginia. I mean, the reason why I chose Cincinnati as the first place to do this work wasn't because it's my hometown, it's because this city has been always a microcosm of the politics that have been the United States.
It's important to point out, and you said this a few moments ago, and you mentioned Vice Mayor and other council members who are here. It would appear, and I know when you first came in, you met Denise Driehaus, who is a county commissioner. One of the first things you said, hey, I need to sit down and talk with you. And she was receptive to it. And they were receptive to it. I think that's good to hear, because a lot of our conversations are about us, them, they, you know, and the reality is that the great thing about Cincinnati, and it might take us a few extra days to get there, but there is this sense that we want to be better. Everybody wants to make this the greatest city on the planet. And that's good. Talk about how receptive our leaders have been to some strong words.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I will give credit to Mayor Pureval 2 years ago when he made the apology about the master plan in 1948 that, you know, summarily led to the destruction of the Kenyon Bar and Lower West End. And that was done in the spirit of so-called progress at the time. But one of the largest urban renewal projects in the country. And of course, there was political and social backlash from that. Anytime that you step outside the norm, or you begin to, especially in this city, ruffle the feathers, or, you know, lift up the sheets and see what's actually hidden below, there's going to be that pushback. But I think that, you know, when we're talking about disrupting systems, it's a necessary pain. In fact, you know, I tell my coalition members from across the country, if we're not making people uncomfortable, then we're not doing our jobs. Because the disparity lies in the comfort of others and not in the comfort of those who have been oppressed. And so what I've really been impressed with is that there's a growing understanding and acknowledgement that change must come, because the city cannot realize its aspirations of being this, continuing to be this economic engine, if we continue to leave such a large part of the population behind. Kansas City is seeing this and you know, really tough, because, you know, some of the decisions, policy decisions that were made to divest from public education have really hampered their ability to draw large companies into the city. If you don't have a viable workforce, what are you going to do? You know, you're not going to draw in companies and such. And so I think having corporate leaders like Procter & Gamble and Kroger that are national and global entities, they understand that systemic inequity is not a long-term financial gain. There are only so many people that are going to be able to afford these $1,000 apples if you leave everybody, you know, behind. And so while that might be a callous way of looking at it, I recognize that that is necessary to have a message in a capitalist in a capitalist society. We have to really look at what is the economic return as well as the social return on these investments. And so that's really where my work has come in, is helping us to look at, when you make these strategic investments, what is both the economic and the social return. They're not separate, they are definitely together and mutually reinforcing.
How about that, huh? Is there anyone out there who has a question? I'm not going to run through the audience like Phil Donahue. Of course, someone way in the back. Oh, you have a microphone?
I think he does.
Oh, wonderful.
Look at that service.
Because it would have been 3 days before I got to you.
Yeah, you are that old, aren't you?
Come in.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marty Eshayans, and I have a question. My question is, we have tons of data that shows the disparities, and yet when we talk with our community members, I wonder how well do we do in getting folks to understand the data and how does it impact their lived experiences? How well do we interpret that data so that as community members, they are actively involved in then how do we put remedies in place? As an example, you made several references to what's happening in the community. And so who then follows up with the community to say, these disparities look like this, they impact your lived experience in this manner? Are we doing things like road shows to actually sit with community councils and so forth to say this is how this disparity looks in your community?
That's a good question. Good
Yeah,
question.
I really appreciate that because that really does mirror the approach that we used here in Cincinnati and really all the communities that I work with across the country. This was a project that started specifically, the wealth gap studies started 3 years ago after our Truth and Equity initiative, which was the center, the museum was a large part of that as well. And we chose Avondale and Riverside because of the disparity data that while you had differences in race, you had many of the same disparities in health, wealth, and well-being. And so it's not so much focusing on the data of disparity because I think anybody who's living it can tell you more about the story behind that data. I don't need to knock people over the head nor insult their intelligence by telling you have a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. Really, Sherlock? You got a degree to come and tell me that? Tell me what I can do about it. And so work with me to help co-create solutions. And that was our specific approach, is over a series of community conversations and also using the data like Avondale already had its own quality of life report. Who am I to come in and tell them when they've already done the deep dive on the data? But that data helped me, and that report helped me to understand the aspirations, the goals of Avondale. And then it was my job as a researcher to say, well, how do we actually turn this into a strategic framework so that we can do something about it? And so just to give you an example of how you change the story, change the narrative from talking about what is disparity, we all know that. What is the opportunity here? And so one of the areas, the key pillars in our report is around debt management. That was something that came out of both community conversations. And so when we talk about data, it's like, what's the data for change? What does change look like? And so we focused for both of those communities on economic and social outcomes. And so the data that helps them understand how they're going to know that life is actually improving are things like reduction in a percent of total debt at the neighborhood level, reduction in a percentage of households who default on future utility or medical payments. The social return will be reduced household stress, improved early childhood development, improved mental health, and reduced community domestic violence, child neglect, and child abuse. Those are data points that actually matter to people who are living in areas of disparity. Don't focus just on the woes, but focus on the things that we can change and the will that actually paves a pathway to hope.
Proof that there is more, proof that there is more to the message of Dr. King and the message of this day than just I have a dream. There's the need for action from all of us. What a great presentation.
Thank you, sir.
And so please give Dr. Wendy Ellis another big round of applause.
Thank you.
Have you enjoyed this morning? Yeah, so have I. So have I. First of all, it was warmer in here than it was outside. But there's a lot going on today, of course, here at the Freedom Center. And before I turn the program over to Woody to close things out, I should point out, you know, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, it's been ranked, you know, one of the top museums in the country for the past 4 or 5 years. Yes, by USA Today, they do these surveys and stuff every year. And I'm told that the center is nominated once again as one of the top museums in the country. Now, you can make it number one by going online and voting. And unlike the election of November, you can vote several times.
No, we're not certain it didn't happen.
Maybe, yeah, we don't even know if that happened back in November, but that's another story. But yeah, you can go online, you can vote every day, right? I think you can vote every day and make Yeah, this USA Today, you can make the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center #1 in the nation. It's always a pleasure to be a part of this breakfast. It starts the day. A lot of events will be taking place. Once again, it's a pleasure for me to be a part of this. Now let me bring back up. Can I recognize Otto and his crew? Didn't they put on a great production here today? All right. All right, and as the producers would always tell me, my time is up.
Yeah, but as one, for old time's sake, can I send you out for a live shot?
No. I'm semi-retired. Woody is all yours.